Welcome to The Writer Reads The Reptile's Blade, Part 3. Not far now, ma'am, he said as he jogged toward the far end. Pickup should be waiting. But Felix wasn't listening. In the few strides they'd taken, she'd felt transported back to the battlefields of Aqua Pearl. The buildings towering above them could have been rock-laced canyon walls intersecting a belt of Ferragore trees. The piles of garbage, Maslow bushes, the rats. Well, there were rats on every world. The fact that these were covered in fur instead of iridescent blue and green scales succeeded in reminding her where she really was. It didn't succeed in damping down her need to take cover. She dragged at Carlyle's hand. "Don't make me carry you, ma'am," he said, pulling harder to get her to the end of the alley and the silver-grey Mercedes waiting there. Felix caught sight of the sunshine reflected from the car roof, the open sky above, the corner with its promise of another storefront alcove, and leapt forward. Part of her was still on Aqua Pearl, and she couldn't tell how many there were, or how close they were to striking. The yawning shelter offered by the Mercedes' open door had her bolting ahead of Carlyle, all thought of storefronts and alcoves forgotten. With a curse, Carlyle bolted after her, pulling the door close as Felix reached under the driver's seat in front, searching for the weapon she knew was concealed there. "Get this thing in the air!" she screamed, and the driver forced his way back into the traffic flow, while the man beside him looked around wildly for the threat. "Ma'am!" Carlyle shouted. "Ma'am!" Wild-eyed, Felix looked past him, peering back at the alley, scanning the skyline and cliff walls, the gun moving with her eyes, her finger light on the trigger as she sought the lizardine attack force she'd sensed in the alley. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Carlyle said, and slapped her gently at the base of the neck. "What?" Felix began. But there was an odd taste in her mouth, and the world was already beginning to blur. Carlyle's hand on the gun as he disengaged it from her grip was a fading memory. "Oh, God," Felix moaned. There was a herd of elephants stampeding through her head, and it tasted like a water buffalo had peed on her tongue. "Easy, ma'am." Carlyle's voice was gentle, his hands firm as he helped her sit and wrapped her palms around a mug of warm, sweet-smelling liquid. "Drink," he said. "You'll feel a lot better." "You drugged me," she said, her memory slowly clearing. "You were having an episode, ma'am." "I thought," Felix began, then paused. What had she thought? That she was still on Aqua Pearl? That she was under attack? Frowning, Felix lapsed into silence, sipped the drink she'd been given. After a moment she asked, "Did I shoot anyone?" "No, ma'am." "Did they see me?" "No, ma'am. Driver was pretty quick on the extra tinting." Felix started to relax. Last thing they needed was 100 civilian witnesses to a government agent waving a gun and screaming. The antidote in her cup was working, clearing her head and removing the taste from her mouth. It did nothing, however, for the growing nausea in her gut. "Carlyle?" Her voice wavered. He helped Felix to her feet and guided her to the bathroom. "I will wait out here, ma'am. You call if you need me." Damn the man, Felix thought. He knows exactly what he's given me. It took close to half an hour for her to purge the rest of the drug from her system, and Felix sat on the floor for a long moment before shakily climbing to her feet and crossing to the sink. And that was when she sensed him again. Spinning away from the sink, she was about to shout when a battle-gloved hand engulfed her jaw and the unmistakable muzzle of a lizardine firearm jammed itself into her stomach. Felix heard a click, and then the painfully clear sound of someone throwing up. "Oh, God," she heard herself moan, and realized she was listening to a recording. "I will not harm you," Micah said, low, so he would not be heard above the recording. Felix nodded. In spite of the weapon in her gut, she knew it was true. If he'd meant her harm, he could have taken her down at the Institute or in the alley. The recording launched into a new round of misery, or when she was throwing up. The pressure in her gut eased, then went away. "You still have it?" Micah said as the battle suit blurred and became visible. Felix blushed, felt the sadness that came whenever she remembered, ducked her head. "And whose fault is that?" "We searched high and low for you," he said. "Your parents—" Felix straightened and snapped her gaze to his. My parents had every right. Mammal, reptile, our chromosomes were never meant to be mixed. They were trespassers. They didn't stand a chance. The mix has served you well, Mika observed. Without it, you would never have been able to hunt us so effectively. I'm a freak. Yes, the lizardine warrior acknowledged. But you are our freak. From the sound of it, Felix judged the recording to be about halfway through, the after effects bordering on dangerous if she'd really still been sick. She would have argued further, but ever predictable, Carlyle knocked at the door. Ma'am? Give me a minute. Felix timed to reply between recorded bouts of throwing up, watched as Mika signaled switching it off. Oh, God, Felix said, giving another realistic groan and shuffling as though standing up. Mika vanished, but his voice whispered in her ear. Give me your address. I need your advice. Advice? Well, that was a first. But Command wanted to know what the lizardine wanted, and if this was the only way to get it without creating a bigger incident than the initial crash and capture, then Felix was willing to play along. She turned on the tap, letting the first few seconds of water run down the drain before cupping her hands and using the rest to rinse out her mouth. Sip, swirl and spit. Sip. The door handle turned. Ma'am, I've been told to check. There was movement as Felix hastily cleared her mouth and reached for a hand towel, a blur, the touch of fingers, battle-gloved once more on the side of her face. A lizardine gesture of thanks. The room appeared to be empty of all else bar her when Carlyle opened the door. Felix fixed him with a stern look. This had better be good, Carlyle. He gave her face a 6-second study, then glanced around the bathroom. Doc said you shouldn't still be throwing up. He said if you kept it up, I was to hit you with one of these. Manx held up a squeeze bulb injector similar to the one he'd used in the car. The sight of its distinctive colour made her feel queasy. The part of her the lizardine had messed with would not get on with that at all. Please don't, Manx, she said, and almost cursed when he returned sharp-eyed attention to her face. She'd gone from Carlyle to Manx in less than a sentence and a pause, and that clearly meant something to her aide. He said nothing, however, but took the injector away, letting the bathroom door close behind him. When Felix emerged, it was to find a freshly drawn pot of tea and a small tray of biscuits on her desk. Carlyle was nowhere in sight, so Felix walked quietly to her office door and looked out. Her aide was sitting at his desk in the reception area outside her office. He glanced up as she appeared. Command wants a report on what happened, he told her, and medical wants you to make an appointment with the psychs. Felix stared at him. Wasn't just me, he said, returning her gaze. There were 3 of us in the car, you know, and regulations. Felix closed her eyes and nodded, waving a hand to stem the flow of words. How urgent is the report? They want it before I take you home. Give me an hour. Felix retreated back into her office and sat down behind the computer. She watched as the door locked itself, felt the hum of sound-dampening technology switch on. Mika, reappearing in front of her desk, was no surprise. You know this office is under surveillance, right? Mika looked smug. The cameras are, as you humans like to say, on the blink. He waved a clawed hand at the wall where a red light was blinking in what might have been frustration. I have a report to write, Felix said, then remembered something of custom. Tea? Mika frowned. Is it safe? I can drink it. Then yes, thank you. You want my advice? Felix asked, pouring him a cup. The sensors aren't working, he said, and Felix smiled. I know, so it should be safe to talk about it. It'll give me some time to think on what can be done. You're willing to aid and abet? Felix shook her head, watched him take a sip. No, but your people sent you for a reason, and they sent you, one of the few they can least afford to lose. For that, they must have something important they need to say. Mika sipped again, studying her over the rim of his cup. The survival of your race depends on it, he said, licking tea drops from his lips with his nimble lizardine tongue. Felix watched. The sight had once fascinated her, but she had since spent hours watching the lizardine at rest and at war. She'd seen them clean dust from their eyes using those tongues. They were a relic of the heritage she hadn't been given, and she didn't know if she was thankful for that or not.